Welcome back to Fireside Chats with Erin. I'm Erin Gowrluck, the president of the Canada Grains Council and your host. This podcast serves as a platform to explore grain sector priorities that reflect the Council's work here at home and around the world. Together, we will discuss issues and ideas with policymakers and industry influencers. And after a brief hiatus this summer, which feels like a distant memory now, we're back with a very compelling fall lineup. And to kick it off, someone who's been on my list since I joined the council a year and a half ago, but he's a busy guy. Goldy Hyder, President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada, a national policy and advocacy association which represents the interests of 170 companies who employ over 2 million staff and are responsible for 50% of Canada's private sector GDP. Goldy is also a member of the board of directors of Open Text Corporation and has a long track record of service on behalf of several charities and nonprofit organizations, including the Coalition for a Better Future and the Business and Higher Education Roundtable. We know that Goldy is a regular commentator in Canadian media on business, politics, and leadership. He hosts the Speaking of Business podcast. That's a good name. His podcast features interviews with Canadian innovators, entrepreneurs, and business leaders. He holds a Master of Arts in Public Policy from the University of Calgary, the city where I grew up. Goldy, thank you for stopping by for a fireside chat.
I'm delighted to be here, Erin. I'm hoping that good things come to those who wait. We'll find out.
Excellent. I expect they do. You have a podcast. Tell us a bit about your podcast.
Yeah, it's a very unique podcast in the sense that obviously the members that you mentioned, I represent about 170 CEOs of some of the largest companies in our country, including some who come from outside of Canada. I sit down with them to really just have a conversation about them as opposed to their businesses per se. When we set out to do this, it was the myth that these people came out of a womb with an MBA from Harvard and walked right into a bank and started running it. And let's humanize them. As I said to them, let's show Canadians and listeners that you don't have an S on your chest. You don't have a cape. Your feet touch the ground. You put your pants on one leg at a time. It's been a wild success. We just crossed our 100th episode. And it's a chance to sit down and talk about life. It's a chance to sit down and talk about leadership. It's a chance to sit down and talk about their journeys. And what jumps out at me the most about this is, first of all, they're very authentic because I think there's a sense of comfort that I'm not out there to get them in any way. I just want to educate our audience. Is there lessons of failure? How many of these leaders have gone through struggle and adversity? And you look at sort of today's generation, you're kind of like, I want instant results and I want, promotions. It's been 2 good weeks. You listen to these struggles and I hope the young people who are listening to them realize life's not a straight line. It has its ups and its downs, but what makes you is how you respond to the downs and how you manage the ups, and so I'm hoping that we'll have another 100 episodes in the future.
Fantastic. Congratulations. I'm sure many of our listeners will want to tune in. Now, before we dive into what I think is going to be a policy-focused conversation, Goldy, tell our listeners a bit about the Business Council and the members, on your members and how you advocate on their behalf.
Yeah, I mean, you covered off the logistics piece, I guess, 170 or so CEOs, 50% of the Toronto Stock Exchange, extremely diverse in terms of region, in terms of sector, diverse in terms of those who operate, in Canada versus North America. And many of them are very global and more are looking to become more and more global. And I know that's something that obviously in your membership is a big piece of the advocacy work that you do. We come at it from the perspective, we're about 48 years old now. In a couple of years, we'll be celebrating our 50th anniversary, very ably founded and led by Tom DeCino, and subsequent to that, John Manley, neither of whom need any introduction to people listening to this podcast. So it's a very privileged place for me to take over from those 2 gentlemen whom I hold in the highest of regards, great Canadians. But the people that have been in the membership are also interested in Canada. They're interested in making Canada competitive. They're interested in ensuring that, the right policy framework exists to create prosperity, not just for their businesses, but also for the citizens and for the communities in which we live. And so it's kind of a simple approach. Let's policies that attract capital, that attract talent are in place, because you don't have to have a complicated formula to know how you build an economy, how you build prosperity, and how you share that in terms of your social programs and the infrastructure that's necessary. So from a policy perspective, you know, the main areas are what I've described. We are obviously very focused in response to things as well. We're very concerned about the fiscal framework, because when you have a lack of discipline in terms of how much you spend versus how much you make, Canadians are smart enough to know that that don't work for them personally, and it shouldn't be believed that it works for our governments. It doesn't. And so we put a lot of emphasis on the math, because the math is indisputable. When you spend more than you make, that's a problem. So we're hammering away at that one. Economic growth. And we are not going to get out of this malaise. We're not going to make society more affordable. We're not going to make prosperity and build the infrastructure and the environment that we need if we don't focus on growth. You're not going to redistribute your way if you haven't created the growth itself first. So that's a big area for our members. Economic security. We put out a major paper on economic security, national security, and that lumps inside it, you know, food security, energy security, our response to the climate. There's so many issues that fall in there, including cybersecurity, something that, again, all members of yours and ours are exposed to on an ongoing basis. So we're trying to keep it high level, because what we are not is an industry association. That's what you do, and that's what hundreds of other associations do, terrifically representing their members' interests. Ours is about getting the macroeconomic policy right, and that is economic, it's social. We stay out of the politics. We're non-partisan. We're apolitical in that sense. And then for Canadians, of course, the big issue is North America, and in particular the relationship with the United States. And I know we're going to dive into that more, because that's job one, is how do we make sure that we have take full advantage of the opportunity that we're afforded, because we share a border with the G1. We have a trade agreement with them, and more broadly with Mexico. That's coming at us in a very real way here.
We are going to unpack some of these issues, but first I want to talk a bit about what you called the malaise. As a country, we're facing some significant challenges. You're well aware Canada's economy has fallen behind its population growth for the fifth straight quarter, down 3.6% compared to 2022, experiencing what RBC recently referred to as a recession-like performance. This is particularly stark when you compare it to the gains that we're seeing south of the border. And now, according to a report published by TD Bank last month, Goldy, addressing Canada's productivity issues requires, in their view, comprehensive strategies, including promoting competition, incentivizing technology adoption, reducing barriers to growth across jurisdictions, and implementing smarter regulations. First of all, how did we end up here in your view?
Well, I think we've become sort of the blessing and the curse of geography that I just referenced. It's awesome to share a border with the G1. You don't actually have to do too much to kind of live off their success in many ways, and we've done that for too long. But they're going in another direction now, and we've got to be eyes wide open about what's taking place down there. And we've got to realize that what got us here isn't going to get us to where we need to go. And so if ever there's a moment that we can't let pass to actually address some of these longstanding issues around productivity, it's right here, right now, because we see in America that is becoming more and more protectionist, whether it's Republican or Democrat. They are clearly turning insular. They are using their currency to attract capital. They're using their currency to attract talent. They're moving quicker in some cases on taxes and on regulation to create a magnet for capital and talent. And we clearly, not just us, but no one else is going to be able to compete with that when you have the advantages that the Americans do. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we get a piece of that pie? How do we get more integration? How do we leverage the conversations that are taking place around friendshoring and nearshoring and so forth, without being protectionist ourselves, without becoming anti-trade, free trade ourselves, because we built this economy on free trade. We are the poster child around the world to say, hey, you know, we give access to 1.5 billion people through our free trade agreements. I know we have a little work to do inside Canada, but luckily we do a pretty good job of it outside Canada. But you asked about productivity, and I just mentioned the interprovincial trade barriers. I think our biggest challenge is we're getting in our own way. The things that are really holding us back, you really actually can't blame the Republicans or the Democrats for. You can't blame globalization or the WTO or anything else. Look at ourselves. Why is it that we have interprovincial trade barriers? What are those? How is it possible that a nation that believes in free trade with entire regions like Europe, like in Asia, and then obviously in the continent ourselves, but internally we put up these obstacles? I can't tell you how many times I have had diplomats and ambassador, high commissioner levels, and others, and consul generals look at me and say, "What are these? We thought we have a free trade agreement with you," but businesses are coming here and realizing that a truck is one thing in one province and called a van in another, or we always talk about the wine examples, but for business, it's about real things, labor mobility. Like we can't move people around. It's a big problem. So we've got to do something about something that former governor of the bank, Polo, had said is up to 3 to 4% of our GDP trapped of our own doing and by our own doing. So that's just, I think it's irresponsible, frankly, that we haven't dealt with that. And we've got to keep mounting pressure on that. You look at our regulatory framework. When I ask our members on a sort of a quarterly basis, what are the issues that you would like us to really hone in on? Regulations shows up again and again and again as just being the pylon effect here. They just keep adding and adding and adding. And those are costs to business. But what people don't get is those costs get passed down to consumers. And so on the one hand, you have politicians saying we're very concerned by affordability, but then they're putting in the measures that are driving up costs that are affecting affordability for customers. So that's a problem as well. So we've got to be much more wiser when it comes to regulation. We need to compete on tax. I've actually never really been lobbying for tax cuts per se, but what we are saying is don't add. Don't be cute in your response to sort of populism, and start targeting tax measures that actually will drive away capital and also drive away talent. The thing about the internet is it's allowed everybody to get access to information that used to be just, for Canadians who subscribe to a newspaper. Now they all know. They can look it up. They don't need you or me to comment on what these challenges are. They're reading about it. And so we've got to make sure we can compete on some of the fundamentals of our economy. We're happy, that we have these free trade agreements, but we also need to renew the USMCA. That's an important thing for our future prosperity and productivity. We've increased our population. You referenced off the top that we're having some growth. The reality is the only growth Canada is having in our GDP is due to population, something that now has led us to a place where Canadians are concerned, because we may have gone too far too fast. I mean, we do believe in population growth, let me be clear. We do believe that immigration is a good policy, but you got to manage it. You got to manage the other half of that coin in terms of infrastructure, in terms of housing. And what's getting in the way of infrastructure? What's getting in the way of housing? Regulations. So there's a lot of own goals here, and I think we can do something about it if we put our minds to it.
Goldy, you touched on this a bit already, but I really want to highlight the extent of the prosperity gap between Canada and the US. The OECD released a report with some data which demonstrates that the Canada-US prosperity gap is widening. Real GDP per capita in the US was 43% higher than in Canada in 2023. And in 2024, it's estimated that this gap will widen to nearly 50%. Now, you've provided a couple of examples already, but can you shed some additional light on how such a large disparity in economic performance can persist between two highly integrated economies?
Yeah, we're just not as productive. They are innovating. They have, in many ways, launched a new industrial policy in the United States. I mean, their economy really is built by the innovation agenda, the investment that attracts, the DARPA model that we have written a lot about here, saying, why can't we have a, sort of a CARPA model? Like, let's build an industrial policy in Canada that plays to our strengths, that leverages our natural resources, that leverages our human resources, that leverages our free trade agreements and our prosperity, the clean energy that we have, the innovative capacity of Canadians themselves. We need to be more ambitious. We don't commercialize our innovation very well. We don't scale our innovation very well. We settle. We build a business and say, oh, I'm going to sell it to somebody for $10 million and buy a cottage in Muskoka or whatever. That's not good enough. Good enough is not going to get us to where we need to do. We need to be bold and ambitious in our vision for this country and the vision for our economy. And I think Canadians would rise to that occasion. You mentioned competition earlier. Businesses love to compete. The issue is it a level playing field? Most of the competitiveness issues in our country are actually caused and impeded upon by government through regulations, through fees. Canadians don't get a chance to have the opportunities that other countries do because they're paying really backdoor taxes for spectrum in our telecommunications industry, for airport fees and landing fees and so forth through our airports. These are things that, again, costs get passed down to the consumer. That makes them poor. I saw a stat that said Canadian incomes are stalled at around 2019 levels. No wonder they're upset. No wonder they're concerned by that. But we need to look at where the root cause of that is, and it is policy. That's why I enjoy doing these kinds of podcasts, is because it may not be a sexy thing to talk about, but boy, does it matter. Policy matters, and it's never mattered more than the change environment we're in today.
Let's talk about some of the work that your organization has been doing on the topic. You recently produced a report on this topic entitled Engines of Growth, where you speak to some of these challenges, citing that, I love this, progress is a policy choice. And you reflected on progress made over the last century by countries like South Korea, Singapore, and Finland, who have developed technology-focused economic roadmaps and policies which essentially have now positioned them as among the world's most advanced economies. What does Canada have to do if we want to achieve similar results?
Well, thank you for the shout out for the Engines of Growth report, authored by my colleague, Robert Asseland, former advisor to Prime Minister Martin, former advisor to Minister Morneau, and to the current Prime Minister as well. This was peer reviewed. This was done in consultation with a lot of organizations and our membership and others. And so it's very much a collective work. It's not just something that one person sat down and wrote. And what we've tried to do is, keep it simple, stupid. Here are 17 recommendations in a country that has, a $500 billion budget. What should we be doing? How do we narrowcast some of these policies that will give us the return on that investment? How do we look at some sacred cows and start thinking about the way we do innovation? Why is money spread around all these departments? What can we learn from best practices, particularly the best practices of the United States around that DARPA model that I referenced? We're being challenged right now in terms of our defense investments and so forth. One of the things we should be doing is thinking about how to get into that supply chain with the United States on that. Same on food, same on energy, ag tech, biotech, clean tech, fintech, you name it. There's a lot of things that Canadians can do. We have the smarts. We're amongst the most educated population and so forth. So our report, I invite people to look at it directly on our website at businesscouncil.ca. Take a look at those 17 recommendations. Maybe, you agree with them, maybe you don't, but let's have the conversation about how to bring about that public policy. Really, the intention here is to make Canadians aware that we just can't rest on our laurels. That because we've had a good 150 or so years doesn't mean the next 150 years are going to automatically be good. We have to have adult conversations about public policy. They need to be fact-based. They need to be consistent with our trade agreements. They need to be cognizant of the reality of the fact that we're in North America and that we're a continent of 500 million people with really only 3 countries. Europe has 500 million people with 27 or so countries, and Asia and so forth. We can't afford to be having internal fights in North America. So we're really trying to take this moment to help promote a Team North America response in terms of how we're going to grow our economies, where everybody gets to benefit from it, right? That it helps the North America compete. So there's a lot there. As I said, I invite people to take a look at it. Our view is that Canadian businesses are ready to invest. They're ready to compete. No one really even asked for an IRA. No one really even asked for the incentives. More than anything, what they want is stable, predictable regulatory and tax policy so the long-term planning can take place. We can't be held hostage to the political cycle. Business needs the confidence to invest, knowing that elections will happen and governments will come and governments will go. But overall, the policy is not going to go from black to white, as we're starting to see in many democracies around the world. And that's a problem because capital is not, and it doesn't have an ideology or a nationality. It goes to where it's welcome.
Our largest trading partner is going to the polls in about 2 weeks. An election could be reasonably called any day now in Canada. Reflecting on the interests of your members, Goldy, if you were to hold the pen, what 2 or 3 commitments would you want to see reflected in any party's platform, regardless of their political stripes?
Well, I think first and foremost, it starts with fiscal discipline. We are just addicted to spending now. I think Canadians are smart enough to know that if they're getting all kinds of programs that we can't afford, those programs' longevity is probably short-lived, because some government is going to come across and say, we can't afford these things. We just can't keep doing that. I think we have to be cognizant that credit agencies are looking at countries and saying, is the math adding up? I was at an event where former Finance Minister Bill Morneau himself said, if we're collecting $500 billion in revenues and spending $540 billion in expenses, how long before your bank calls you? Try doing that at home. See how that goes. And yet Canadians, I think, get it. Canadians get it. I think there's rising concern on the parts of Canadians on the management and the mismanagement of our public finances. The size of our public sector has grown. What are they all doing? What programs have they successfully launched? Have they implemented them? Are they viable? So that fiscal discipline question, we're going to put a lot of attention on. And all we're really saying is be disciplined in how you allocate spending, because the borrowing costs, the more they rise, those are dollars not spent on Canadians. That's the bottom line there. Then the issue of regulatory reform. It affects cross-sectorally. This is not unique to just financial sector, others. This is cross-sectorally. Everywhere I turn, people are saying regulatory pylon is adding to costs. It's adding to unpredictability. It's creating instability, and that either creates capital chill, where you start seeing share buybacks and dividends because they're not confident in how to deploy that capital, or you see capital flight because it moves to where it's welcome. And as I said earlier, there's a lot of places in the world where countries are competing hard to get that capital. Finally, I would say the importance of the resources. Canada is just so resource rich. Everywhere I turn, critical minerals are being sought after by many, many countries. We don't have the roads, we don't have the train tracks, we don't have access to our ports, we don't have the capacity in terms of expanding our ports to meet the demand. We don't want to get trapped of doing with our critical minerals what ended up happening with oil and gas for so long, which is a single customer who buys it for 30 cents on the dollar, refines it and sells it at a markup back to us. That's absurd. So we should make sure that we're building the infrastructure to get our resources, whether you're talking, potash or uranium or, agriculture, food, et cetera, energy. All of these things are in high demand from our allies around the world. And we can't disappoint them, as we did to Germany and Japan and Korea around LNG. We're saying, what is with you? Like, you have it, we need it. You're for climate change in terms of, bringing emissions down and managing climate change. We run coal plants. We're desperate for some gas, and we weren't able to deliver. And word spreads pretty quickly that you're not going to do that. That doesn't mean it comes at the expense of the innovation on hydrogen or carbon capture or small modular nuclear reactors. We believe in all of those. But it's not an or strategy, it's an and strategy. And so these are things that I hope our election has the forum in which to have these adult conversations about. I think Canadians deserve that.
I hope so too, Goldy. Let's talk for a moment about how to make this happen, how we're going to inform and influence the conversation. That's what we do with these national associations. Can we talk for a moment about Poilievre's op-ed that was published in the National Post in May of this year? The article in which he said, and I quote, "The Chamber of Commerce, Business Council, and the Canadian Federation of Independent Business holds pointless luncheons, meetings, and writes op-eds or records interviews that almost no one sees. As the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, I refuse to meet with the aforementioned groups. They tell me what I already know." So what I want to know, Goldy, is this just political posturing? As the leader of an industry association myself, I have a keen interest in understanding what role associations are going to play under a Poilievre government. I don't know, for example, that agriculture policy is going to be a point of discussion at the doorstep. Conversations which Poilievre has suggested are ultimately going to serve as the basis for Conservative policy. So surely you've thought about how associations like the Business Council are going to navigate this potential reality. What do you think?
Well, look, we're going to leave the politics to the politicians. Our objective here is to recognize that things are changing in terms of how we need to engage our public sector, our political sector, and Canadians writ large. Social media has changed that game. It's not something that Mr. Poilievre invented or created. What he's saying effectively is many of us already know what we're going to do or what we want to do, and it may be what you want done. So don't waste your time continuously telling us through policy papers and policy documents and lobby days and lunches and all of that. Bring the public along. And I think that's something we need to take heed of. We need to recognize that our role is also to engage the public. We need to make sure that Canadians understand what's at stake here of the issues that we're speaking about. I sleep well at night, despite everything we've been discussing, because I trust the collective wisdom of Canadians. I do believe we're a smart group of people. I think if we're respected, and if we are shared, if information is shared with us, we will have a dialogue, we will debate it. And you know what else, Aaron? We'll disagree with each other, but we will come to a place where we will say, all right, let's go forward with free trade as we did in 1988. We think we can do this. Or let's expand it to include North America as we did in 1993. So let's take that message that's being delivered and not be thin-skinned about whether the industry associations are doing a great job or not. And hear the message of our politicians are about getting elected. That's not new. That's how the game works. But now more than ever, the role of the public has been enhanced because of social media, because of all these movements that have been created and so forth. We need to recognize that the landscape has changed, and we don't have to become political. We just have to know that we need to ensure that Canadians understand that the things we're talking about, how it helps them economically, and socially, and hopefully politically, because we'll get better governance and better public policy as an outcome.
Thanks, Goldy. An important perspective. I want to take a moment to dive into a couple of particular policy matters that are certainly of interest to our members, but I know are also of interest to your members. There are many issues where the Liberals and the Conservatives have a clear difference of opinion, but I want to focus for a moment on one where we may be less clear on the details of a Conservative plan or approach, which is leaving some organizations feeling uncertain about how to advance their interests. And that is on the topic of sustainability or the environment. So many of your members, just as ours, have established initiatives or targets in an effort to reduce their overall impact on the environment. In some cases, multinational companies have global targets that they're striving to achieve. So I think that as associations, we have found a way to navigate this topic with the current government because it's been a clear focus for them. Whether you agree with their approach or not, they've been relatively clear about their expectations. How, in your view, is this topic best addressed with the Conservatives?
I think in either case, what's important is the facts. And, this government has, as you said, been clear about its objectives. But sometimes the facts have gotten in the way, and we have to keep reminding of the facts. For example, for the longest time, it wasn't keen on nuclear, and yet, ever since the Russian, the actions in Ukraine, a change in position has taken place, which is good. We do want our political people to change with the events and with the facts that come about. So you want to ensure that the facts are front and center for everyone. Decisions made by companies are not just made because of public policy. They're also made because of what shareholders want. And if shareholders are moving towards the importance and recognize the importance of policies that they feel is good for business. I mean, I've always believed, and I think many believe, doing good is good business. And so many companies are going to continue to do the kinds of things that they need to do, not because of policy edicts, but it's the right thing to do for their company, for their shareholder, for their employees, for the communities in which they operate. The root of this issue for the Conservatives, I think, will be their approach. Again, Liberals have their approach, Conservatives have theirs, not judging either one. The Conservatives are going to, from what I've seen and read, are really putting the emphasis on innovation as being key to getting to the targets that we're setting out there. And so for us, that's like, okay, if you form a government and that's going to be your policy, tell us the rules. Tell us, some predictable ways in which the regulations will apply. What are you going to do with some of the issues around partnerships with corporations in terms of working together? like they're doing in the United States. Like it's not all being done just by government. Both business and government are working together. How can we work together? What kind of a policy will we need, for example, on immigration? What kind of a policy will we need on foreign skills accreditation? What kind of a policy will we need on the need to build infrastructure to meet with some of the objectives that I think a new government would have around getting more of our products from the energy sector in particular to market? Just set the rules, tell us what they are, whether we agree or disagree, or whether there's some differences of opinion. You ran for office, you got elected, you're going to set the policy. We're going to have to respond and adjust to that, and we're prepared to do it. And we're prepared to compete to do it. It's all businesses say is make sure there's a level playing field, that the rules are clear, and then get out of the way. Let us do what we do. Canadian businesses are going to be at the forefront of this transition. Our issue is it has to be fact-based. We are in a world where we're still going to need fossil fuels. People don't want to hear that, but it's the truth. Those cars that you're taking off the road, if you bought an EV, we're not having a funeral for them. They're being sent somewhere else to drive, and they're still going to run with gasoline. So why not ours? Why should it be from Venezuela or Iran or somewhere else? Why not ours? LNG is going to help get emissions down for those countries that are committing to coal for the next several decades. Coal plants are being built in China or in India. We need to get them off that by getting our products to those markets. So I think there'll be some alignment on the energy side to say, let's make sure we help other countries bring their emissions down and leverage, for example, Article 6 that's out there. There's lots of discussions about how to do it, but there's a reason it's there. The reason it's there is emissions don't respect borders. They don't do customs and immigration. They're mobile, and they're going to, if you have to solve a global problem globally. And so I think you can see innovation as being the route to that. Canadian businesses are innovating now. Hydrogen, carbon capture, SMRs. These are all examples of things that you're going to see more of. They're just not ready today. The scale that's necessary, the projects that need to be completed, the infrastructure that needs to be built, even to capture carbon, you're going to need to build pipe. It has to be stored somewhere. It can't just be stored anywhere. So these are facts that we hope any government will understand and build the policy framework to enable the investment, to enable that growth to occur. And governments benefit from that because that means we're having economic growth and economic prosperity, which means that they don't have to drive us into further and further deficits and debt. They can start growing our economy.
Thanks, Goldy. Before I move into my last question, my closing question, I'd like to get your perspective on a bill that's of particular interest, not only to our members in the grain industry, but to all segments of the export-oriented agriculture industry, which is about 90% of the sector. And that is Bill C-282, which is an act to amend the Department of Foreign Affairs Act, a bill which would prevent Canadian trade negotiators from giving up any more concessions on Canada's highly protected supply managed industry, dairy, eggs, poultry. If passed, what impact would this bill have on Canada's export-dependent sectors, many of whom are represented by your council?
Well, we've written about this. Thank you for flagging it. There are many organizations have flagged this as a bill that would have tremendous unintended consequences. It would frankly be contradictory and fly in the face of our brand around the world, which is we are free traders. We believe in free trade. We believe in access to markets. We believe that free flow of goods and services in a trade agreement is the way to bring about prosperity to people, to our economies, to bring about growth. And so I'm concerned that, and by the way, this had all party consensus, so it's not like it was any one. What you're seeing here is likely an outcome of the impact of populism, which concerns me as it often can lead to bad public policy. And as we've discussed throughout this podcast, policy matters. If you get it wrong, it's going to have consequences. And so at a time in which we're seeing protectionism rising in the United States, I've mentioned it. Interestingly, when I go down to Washington, they're flagging this piece of legislation saying, what's this all about? This is a problem for us because it in some ways flies in the very essence of the USMCA and our trade negotiations. This could handicap us as we enter into that conversation. We're already, on their bad books in terms of our lack of commitment and being able to meet our commitments on defense. We hear about, the digital services tax. Add this to the list. That's not a good place to be when you're entering into, an environment in which countries are saying that they want to, quote unquote, renegotiate this agreement when it's supposed to be a review. We want to take irritants off the table, not add to them. And we certainly don't want to draw attention to measures that are more and more protectionist. And people need to understand protectionism will create in rising costs for consumers. That's not a partisan statement. That's not a statement on behalf of just, business or anything. That's just proven to be true. Protectionism will create rising costs for our consumers who, as you've just mentioned, are stalled in, per capita GDP wage growth, are stalled in, the environment in which we find ourselves right now economically. Why would we slip one more time, add another slip to it? It doesn't make any sense at all. So I'm hoping that the work that the Senate is doing, credit to Senator Hyder and Senator Beam and others who brought in a lot more light on this issue to say, let's be careful here. And I think there's bipartisan support in the Senate to say, is this what we really want to do? And so we're hoping that logic and cooler heads prevail on this issue, and that people see that this is something that would amount to one more own goal that doesn't need to be.
Absolutely. I think there has certainly been an ongoing debate about the potential impact of this bill, but I think with respect to what you said, especially in the conversations that you're having with folks in Washington, it's the signal that it sends. It's the wrong signal at the wrong time.
Well, it's hard to call them out on protectionism if this is the bill that's making its way.
This is the bill that's floating around. I wouldn't disagree at all. This has been an excellent conversation, Goldy. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. But I have a closing question, if you wouldn't mind. Oh, just bear with me. I've lost my question here, Goldy, so now I'm going to need to read you. Here we go. So I have a personal interest in leadership, Goldy, having studied the topic as part of my graduate degree. And I think that increasingly these unprecedented challenges that we face require unprecedented leadership. So I want to close all of my conversations by asking my guests to weigh in on the topic. Now, one of the reasons that I took the job at the Canada Grains Council is its unique structure. I don't know if you're aware, but it doesn't exist in any other jurisdiction that you have the entire grain value chain together around one table. And having leaders from the various sector segments around your board table is a pretty unique and special opportunity, and it's one that I value. And association leadership is incredibly rewarding, but I think you can also attest to the fact that it's not without its challenges. And when you have diverse representation, it brings diverse perspectives and opinions. We have 42 members. Your organization represents 170 Canadian companies operating in every sector, in every region across the country. Talk to me a bit about how you go about delivering value to such a diverse membership and to so many organizations who, to your point earlier, in many cases have their own industry associations. How do you effectively lobby on their behalf?
Yeah, I think the benefit of this is that right from our mission, it's about Canada. It's about the country. It's about our economy. It's about our place in the world. And so getting the macroeconomic policies right around what we call the fundamentals. If your regulatory policy is off, if your tax policy is off, if your immigration policy is off, if your trade policy is off, the odds are the trickle-down work that happens at the industry associations, it's going to get harder, not easier. But if we can get the big picture right, then the industry associations can come in from behind and say, listen, we saw this policy here. There's a couple of clauses that you got wrong. Here's the reason. Here's the best practices. Here's an example of what would happen. Here's the cost benefit analysis, et cetera, et cetera. Let's win on those terms, because if you get the big picture wrong, it doesn't really matter what clauses they got wrong. It's going to, the house of cards will tumble. And so what we try and do is keep the focus on Canada, keep the focus on keeping Canada competitive, making sure that people see that if we get the big picture right, we can really start working away at the other pieces of it. And great work is being done by industry associations, yours for sure, and many others across the country that are working hard on behalf of not just your members, but the employees of those members, which are in the millions and millions of people. We often have this divide that's being created around, oh, big business is bad and we're all for the SME. Well, two things I always say about that. First of all, where do these workers work? They work in these large organizations, and these SMEs, their aspiration is to become a big business. They're not saying, oh, geez, I hope I can stay small. CAE is a company that started off with about 65, 66, 67 people or so when they got going as a small business. They have thousands and tens of thousands of employees around the world. The odds are people listening to this podcast are flying on a plane where the training for that pilot was done. Their ambition was to grow, to be big, to compete. And we need that to be reflected in our policy discourse, in our political discourse. And we need Canadians to see that when that happens, we all win. And that's what we're all about, is how can Canada win in a very competitive environment? And as I said throughout this podcast, policy matters. Aaron, you know that, and I know that. But we need to make sure that, Canadians and your listeners and our political leaders understand that money follows message. You get the message wrong, money won't come.
That is an excellent note on which to end this fantastic conversation. Thank you, Goldy, for your time and perspective today. I hope that you found this episode as thought-provoking and inspiring as I did. Remember, these Fireside Chats with Aaron are monthly, so mark your calendars. We will be back next month with another great conversation. Stay connected with us for more engaging conversations that delve into the heart of the grain industry. You can catch us on your favorite podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Just search for Fireside Chats with Aaron and hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Until next time.